It's day 6 of Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers, and today is all about the ramping. We get an absurd green repeatable ramp spell, and also on the other hand, one of the worst mana rocks, if you can even call it a mana rock I've ever seen, and a whole bunch more stuff, so let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers. So, I know it's Sunday, but we still have a ton of stuff to talk about today. Some sweet rares, a couple of mythics, some really cool stuff, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start talking spicy new Murders at Karlov Manor cards. Before we do, two quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk Murders at Karlov Manor. First up today, we get an interesting new green mythic in Undergrowth Recon. So 3-mana enchantment says at the beginning of your upkeep, return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So obviously, this card is really powerful, right? Like, once it's on the battlefield, it ramps you for free every single turn. However, it's also kind of a narrow card. For it to work at all, you gotta have a lot of lands in your graveyard or some sort of plan for repeatedly getting a land in your graveyard. So it's a card that's very, very good, but it's only gonna work in specific decks. Decks either built around it or like self-mill decks that are just mass filling the graveyard. I also wonder a little bit if it's gonna be fast enough for constructed. If you think through the math of this card, let's say you're living the dream. You're self-mill, so you're filling your graveyard, so you're always gonna have lands in your graveyard. You play this on turn 3. Turn 4, you ramp the first time, but the land comes into play tapped, so you don't actually get any extra mana on turn 4. Turn 5, you finally start getting the extra mana, and you're essentially +1 mana for every turn this is on the battlefield, which is really strong. Like, once this gets rolling, this is going to quickly add to your mana, but it's not going to ramp you in the early game from like 3 to 5 or whatever. It's more of a slower form of ramp. So the obvious comparison here, Crucible of Worlds. Crucible of Worlds, also 3 mana, also lets you play lands from your graveyard. The main differences here are Crucible of Worlds, the lands come into play untapped, which is nice. The big drawback is, though, it eats up your land drop for the turn. So you can't, like, play a land from your graveyard with Crucible and play one from your hand or whatever. With Undergrowth Retcon, this is a bonus land, so you can still make your land drop for the turn and also get the Undergrowth Retcon land. So Crucible Worlds really is not actually ramp. It's more about getting back specific lands repeatedly, like your Field of Ruins or whatever, protecting your important lands, where Undergrowth Retcon is straight up ramp. So my first thought for this card is, Watsy, please, one time. How about a strip mine in standard? What do you think? Just a little strip mining. This works really well with lands that sack themselves to blow up your opponent's lands. Obviously, the dream is strip mine, where you just kind of like strip mine lock someone by getting back a strip mine every turn to blow up their land. If they won't give us strip mine, I'll settle for Wasteland in Modern Horizons 3. But we can kind of try to do this in standard with Field of Ruin, Demolition Field. The only downside is these only blow up non-basic lands, and they replace the land with a basic land. And I was looking at the standard meta, and most of the top tier decks just play too many basics for this to be a realistic plan. Even like Rakdos mid-range, those decks are playing like 8 basics a lot of time. Domain has like 10 plus basics in it. Mono red obviously is just gonna have a million mountains. So I feel like this plan probably not realistic enough for standard, but it could be pretty sweet in like Explorer, Pioneer, those style of formats. We actually just played a land destruction deck in Pioneer that really embraced Field of Ruin, Demolition Field with Sunken Citadel to make extra mana, and it worked way better than I would have thought. And I think Undergrowth Retcon would be amazing in that deck, just as a way to get back a Field of Ruin effect every single turn to keep blowing up your opponent's lands. As far as standard is concerned, I think the most powerful way to take advantage of this card is actually the Streets of New Capenna fetch lands. So real fetch lands, actually not that great with Undergrowth Retcon. They're fine, but because they come into play tapped, they're really slow. So let's say you have a Scalding Tarn or whatever in your graveyard. You get it back with Undergrowth Retcon, but it's going to be tapped. So that means the following turn, you're going to finally untap it. But the way the timing works with Undergrowth Retcon triggering at the beginning of your upkeep, there's actually not a window to like sack the Scalding Tarn you got back the previous turn and have it in the graveyard to get it back with Undergrowth Retcon the next turn. So you're going to need at least 2 fetch lands to do this like slow ramp plan. But the Streets of New Capenna fetch lands work super well with this because they don't have to tap. untap, they just ETB and sacrifice themselves, and you get to gain a life, and you get to tutor out a land. It comes into play tapped, whatever. But with one of these, you can just get an extra land every single turn in Standard, assuming you got enough basics in your deck. So maybe there's something we can do with these fetch lands in Undergrowth Recon. Of course, this does require playing kind of underpowered common fetch lands, which maybe powers down your mana base too much. The other place this seems really good is some sort of like land graveyard deck. We've seen some like Soul of Windgrace Jund decks, some Blossoming Tortoise Mill Ramp style decks. Those decks probably fill the graveyard enough that Undergrowth Recon can just be played fairly there, even discounting any fetch land shenanigans or anything. Could also maybe show up in just like a self-mill deck. I was thinking, every set, gotta make her Burglar Grave work, Soul of the Lost, Cruel Somnophage. These decks, I don't know what we're really ramping into, so I'm not sure it's actually worth it. I guess some like big X spell like Old Stick Fingers or something, but it would be the style of deck that should always have a bunch of lands in the graveyard, just because you're mass milling yourself so much, you're naturally gonna hit some lands. Once you get back to older formats, one of the uses of Crucible of Worlds that we see is protecting your important lands in land deck. So maybe you're playing Tron. Sometimes Tron has like Crucible of Worlds in the sideboard to fight through their opponent's land destruction effects. Undergrowth Recon kinda does the same thing, although I'm not sure it's actually really meaningfully better than Crucible of Worlds in that role. Could also work in like Maze's End, in Pioneer, or Historic, or Timeless. Another deck where you really specifically need these certain lands on the battlefield to work, and your opponent's going to try to blow them up. Also really synergizes with Splunking. All the slowness we were talking about, that goes away once you have a Splunking on the battlefield to make your lands ETB untapped. Then Undergrowth Recon becomes really busted. As far as Modern is concerned, or those formats, I'm kind of guessing it's not going to be worth it over like just playing a Renin 6 or a Crucible or something. So I don't think it's really going to show up there, but I do think it has some power in Commander. So again, like I was talking about before, I don't think the plan of being like, okay, I got a decent amount of fetch lands in my deck, I'm just going to throw this in and hope for the best, I don't think that's really going to be worth it. I think in Commander, you're really looking for one of two archetypes for this card to really be powerful. One is just like self-mill graveyard decks like Madroltha or Sidisi. These decks are just so good at getting cards in their graveyard that you should always have a land to get back from your graveyard. And then this is just insane ramp. When this is like rampant growth with upside every single turn, that's a pretty busted card for 3 mana. The other place it really fits in Commander is in land sack decks, or like landfall land sack decks, like Thalian Gitrog Monster, the literal Gitrog Monster, Lord Windgrace. These are decks that are always sacrificing lands. They have upsides from having lands get into the graveyard, being sacrificed. So this is a way that you can just keep getting back the lands that you're sacrificing to synergize with your Commander. The other place that I'm less sure about is just dedicated landfall. Is this going to be worth it in like an Omnath deck or his Sai, a deck that's just all about having as many lands enter the battlefield as possible? I think the answer here is really going to depend on your mana base. So the problem with these decks is they're not especially good at filling your graveyard. So unless you're playing a pretty expensive blinged out fetch land heavy mana base, which hopefully you are because fetch lands work really well with landfall, but if you are playing that mana base, then this is probably pretty good. If you're playing like 10-15 fetch lands in your deck, that's probably enough that you're just going to get the repeated value. Like I said before, with real fetch lands, you really want 2 to do the loop every turn, but that's pretty realistic if you're playing like 15 fetch lands in your deck. On the other hand, if you're playing more of a budget mana base with these cards, then I think this is going to be a lot worse, because I don't think you're going to have the lands in the graveyard to take advantage of it. So Undergrowth Recon, really strong card, but you got to be a very specific deck to actually take advantage of its power. But I do think this card definitely has uses. Gonna see a lot of Commander play, and probably some in Standard, and maybe even in very specific decks in older formats as well. We also got Treacherous Greed, and this card is really interesting. So a 3-mana Orzhov instant. It says, is an additional cost to cast this spell, sack a creature that dealt damage this turn, draw 3 cards, each opponent loses 3 life, and you gain 3 life. So this card is really strong. I mean, it's a 3-mana draw 3 that also lightning helixes your opponents, which is a really, really strong effect for 3 mana. The problem is, it is also really restricted. You not only have to sack a creature, that's not a big deal. Sacking a creature is fine. You have to sack a creature that dealt damage this turn, and that really makes me wonder if we're going to be able to jump through that hoop to be able to embrace this card's power. So we've seen many of these like sack a creature, draw a card effects be very good in the past. So Village Right, Deadly Dispute. The thing is, you can just sack any creature. It doesn't have to be one that dealt damage. And if you look at sack decks, a lot of them aren't about dealing damage really. They're more about like doing these value-y things and setting up this combo turn rather than like attacking. I also can see comparisons to like Painful Truce or even like Siphon Mind, how like you're hurting your opponents and you're getting to draw 3 cards. So I can see comparisons to those cards, and these are all really playable commander cards. The real question is going to be like, can we have a creature that dealt damage to cast this? If you're a sack deck and you consistently can have a creature that dealt damage to be able to turn this on, this is going to be one of the strongest cards in your deck. Can you build that deck though? Part of the problem here too is it specifically says dealt damage. So my first thought was like, ooh, Cauldron Familiar. ETBs, each opponent loses life, you gain a life. That does not actually work. Damage is loss of life, but loss of life is not the same as damage. So you can't just like Cauldron Familiar, drain your opponent, sack the Cauldron Familiar, because it didn't technically deal damage. It made your opponent lose a life. So weird technicality there. Same issue with like Oni Call Anvil decks in Standard. Like that's the premier sack deck in Standard right now, but Oni Call Anvil isn't a creature. Like you're making these artifact tokens that don't really get in combat damage. So it's going to be hard to actually turn this on in the most popular sack decks. Some of the tricks for this card, there are ways to make it work. So like Voldaren Epicure, probably the easiest way to do it. You just Voldaren Epicure, ping ya, sack the Epicure during the same turn, draw 3, drain ya. That's a pretty powerful line, but that's still just one card. Also worth mentioning, it doesn't say combat damage, so you can like Sunshot Militia, tap a couple things, ping ya for 1, sack the Sunshot Militia, or like Zoyoya Lava Tongue, deals 3 damage to your opponent if they didn't discard a card or sacrifice a permanent on your end step, so you get that damage, then you sacrifice it to draw a card. So there are some ways to build around it like that. I think maybe the easiest way is actually just cheap evasive creatures. Rather than trying to like have creatures that deal damage with the ETB, maybe you just like Billowas Skull Dweller. Like who wants to block a 1/1 Death Toucher? No one really. You don't want to put a real creature in front of that. Same with like Fang and Shigeki. So you can probably hit your opponent for 1 because they don't want to trade a good creature for your 1/1. And then that'll turn on your Treacherous Greed to be able to sacrifice it and hit your opponent for a bunch, refill your hand. Same with cheap flyers like Fairy Dream Theft or Spyglass Siren. Those also would work well. Just swing in, hit for 1, sacrifice it. The downside is it doesn't really work with the most popular sack creatures. If you look at sack creatures, people really want to be sacking like Greedy Freeboot or Unlucky Witness or Crawling Chorus, and I'm just not sure how you make these cards deal damage to sack them to Treacherous Greed. So I don't know, maybe some sort of pinger deck would be kind of funny, but can you build a whole deck around this effect? Maybe the best home for this, and a place I'm definitely going to try it, is in Black-White Spirits, which we've played like in Modern, we've played it in Historic, and that deck is really good at just making 1/1 flyers. So in that deck, you like Lingering Souls and Bitter Blossom and make a bunch of these cheap flyers. You swing in, you hit your opponent, and you don't really mind sacking like 1/4 of a Lingering Souls or 1 turn of Bitter Blossom activations to draw 3 cards and hit your opponent for 3 and gain 3 life. So that might be one of the sneaky homes for this card. As far as Commander, I think a lot of what we've been talking about for Constructed applies, where this is a powerful card, but it's going to be hard to turn on. But there could be some decks like Tisa Karlov, all about death and sacrificing things, but can you get a creature that dealt damage to turn it on? Alenda, maybe Thales might even be better, going back to like the spirit token thing. Thales just makes a bunch of small spirits with flying that you can hit someone with and then sacrifice to draw cards. So I think the TLDR on this card is it's really strong, but I'm not sure there's a deck that can actually use it. It's going to be a big deck building challenge. I think the reward of this card, a 3-mana draw 3 that gains you 3 and hits your opponent for 3, is high enough that it's going to be worth like trying to build in a way to take advantage of it. But it's also going to be a really, really hard challenge because most of the normal sack tricks just don't work with this card. So if you have some ideas of where this fits and how to turn it on, definitely let me know because it's a really, really cool design. We also got Hunted Bonebrute. So Hunted Bonebrute, 3-mana 6/2 skeleton beast with menace. When it ETBs, target opponent creates 2 1/1 white dog creature tokens, and then when it dies, each opponent loses 3 life, and you can disguise it for 2. So play it face down for 3 as a 2/2 ward 2 creature, flip it up for 2 mana. The trick here of the design is obviously if you disguise it, then you don't give your opponent the dog tokens. If you just run this out on turn 3 face up, it's kind of sketchy, right? Like, sure, you get a 6/2 with menace, but you gave your opponent 2 1/1s, and 2 1/1s can block a 6/2 with menace. So unless you're like killing those 1/1s or have some plan for it, you're kind of like paying 3 mana to make your opponent lose 3 life once the tokens trade with the Bonebrute. I do like that this calls back to the Hunted cycle from original Ravnica. One of my favorite cycles. It's just such cool designs. They do janky things, and also some of my favorite sleeper cards in Commander that no one plays. In Commander, if you can politic the Hunted cycle, they're actually really, really good, right? Because you get this super undercosted creature like a Hunted Horror, 2 mana 7/7, and you give someone who you're hopefully going to be allied with a couple of 3/3s, and you can attack the arch enemy or whatever. So I feel like Hunted cards are actually like super criminally underrated in Commander. Hunted Bonebrute, definitely less exciting. Part of the way that the Hunted cycle in original Ravnica worked is the hunted creatures, the tokens they would give your opponent, were never enough to actually kill the hunted creature itself. You see that with Hunted Horror. You give your opponent 2 3/3 Gain Centaurs with Pro Black, but you get a 7/7. So your opponent gets 6 power and toughness. You get 7 power and toughness. So you can still like attack and do all those shenanigans. Hunted Bonebrute, it gives your opponent enough power to actually just kill the Hunted Bonebrute, which is a big, big downside. So I actually think this card is like kind of bad. I'm scared to say this because then people are just gonna like run it out on turn 3 and kill me with it in Standard, but I think this card is pretty bad, but I think there are some fringe uses for it. So the big downside is it just dies to everything, right? We see these weird power and toughness combinations because of the morph rule of Wizards not wanting people to flip up morphs and like blow people out in combat. So you end up with all these like really low power high toughness creatures or really high power low toughness creatures, but that leads to an issue where like Hunted Bonebrute dies to literally everything, right down to a play with fire. So the removal, like the nightmare, you cast this, you give your opponent the dogs, and then are like, oh, play with fire, kill you with the dogs. That's gonna be pretty bad. And I think that means this card only works in very narrow decks. So the first place this could work is some sort of fight rigging deck. This, kind of like Pugnacious Hammerskull, is a 3 mana creature that is big enough that it turns on fight rigging the turn that it comes into play. So the more of those creatures, the better fight rigging gets. So I think that's one home for it. The other place, and this is like super duper janky place, but you remember our infamous Daggerburn deck? The whole idea of the deck was to give opponents creatures to trigger Trespasser's Curse and Blood Artists eventually to like burn them out of the game. In a deck like that, giving the opponent 2 dogs actually becomes an upside rather than a downside. So maybe we got to revisit Daggerbird with this card. In Commander, I guess if you're playing a deck like Griswold that's all about giving your opponent creatures, it could be good. Otherwise, I think Hunted Bonebrute, it looks like a bulk rare to me. It's going to be fun to build around. It's a cool design, but 2 toughness and giving your opponent 2 dogs, probably going to kill it from a competitive perspective. We also got Ezrim Agency Chief, which I think is actually like a very strong card. So it is a 5 mana Azorius Legendary Archon Detective. It's a 5/5 with flying. When it enters the battlefield, you investigate twice, so make 2 clue tokens. Then for 1 mana, you can sack an artifact to give it your choice of Vigilance, Lifelink, or Hexproof until end of turn. So Ezrim, first off, this is one of the most absurd limited bombs in the set. I think this is the card that you probably want to open most of your pre-release. The ability to have this like huge flyer that can protect itself with hexproof and can draw you cards with the clues and like give you lifelink or vigilance if necessary. That's going to be a really good card for closing out games of limited. And I think it might also be true for constructed. If you look at the history of like big flying creatures that can give themselves hexproof, they're usually very good finishers in control decks or some mid-range decks in Standard. And this goes all the way back to Morphling, which I know doesn't technically have flying, but it can gain flying. But these cards that can give themselves hexproof for Shroud, really hard for most decks to deal with. So you play the control game, trade off resources, eventually stick one of these, and use it to close out the game. I don't know if Ezrim is quite as strong as Dream Trawler. Dream Trawler was like one of the strongest versions or recent versions of this effect, but I think it's actually like pretty close. It's 1 less mana, it makes you the clue tokens, and its way to protect itself actually lines up really well with the Standard format, because outside of the clue tokens it makes, there's a ton of ways to just put artifact tokens on the battlefield, like Spyglass Siren, our new Thraben Inspector, Novus Inspector. They just make maps or clues, which yeah, you can sacrifice for value, or you can sacrifice to your Ezrim. You got Denick, the backside, can make clue tokens. Elquist makes a clue token. So you can see just like right here, some sort of like blue white clue artifact token deck where Ezrim's going to be an absurd finisher. It makes enough clues to protect itself twice, all by itself, but any additional artifact tokens you get on the battlefield are extra ways to protect your Ezrim, to give it lifelink, to use it to close out the game. There's also additional options in other colors like Goose Mother makes a ton of food, Voldaren Epicure makes blood, Collector Vault make treasures. We just live in a world where one of the big themes of recent sets have been put a somewhat useful trinkety artifact token on the battlefield, and Ezrim just really benefits from that kind of metagame, so I think it lines up really well with 2024 Magic, except for the fact that there are still some popular removal spells that get rid of it. It doesn't do anything to protect itself from Sunfall. Sheoldred's Edict could take up and play if Ezrim becomes a thing, but despite these drawbacks, I think that Ezrim has a look of a card that not only is going to be one of the best opens for limited, but I think this can be a really solid finisher in blue-white control, blue-white mid-range, some sort of clue style deck in standard too. We also got a new case enchantment in Case of the Crimson Pulse. So Case of the Crimson Pulse, 3 mana, when it enters the battlefield, discard a card, then draw 2 cards. To solve the case, you gotta be empty-handed. You gotta get hellbent, no cards in hand. Once you solve the case, at the beginning of your upkeep, you discard your hand, then you draw 2 cards. So this is a very interesting card, and I think it certainly has uses in very specific decks. So if you think about what this card does, it's essentially an upgraded Tormenting Voice. The upgrade of the first level of Case of Crimson Pulse is if you're empty-handed, it still works. It's not a, if you discard the card, you draw 2 cards. If you're empty-handed, you just run this out and draw 2 cards for 3 mana. Not busted or anything at 3 mana, but fine. And then once you actually solve the case, you essentially get a Dangerous Wager every hand. So, of course, if you're going to play this card, you're going to have to be a very low to the ground aggro style deck, because you're going to want to be able to use the cards that you draw each turn, or else you're going to really not get any value out of them. If you're drawing a bunch of like 5 drops and 6 drops that you can't cast, you're just going to discard them to your Case of Crimson Pulse. But if your deck is full of really low to the ground stuff, I think this can work. We saw this in the past with like Avaricious Dragon being a sweet top end card for like burn style decks, mono red style decks, and it has a similar ability. You get to draw an extra card on your draw step, but then in your end step, you got to discard your hand. So basically, you got to use the cards this turn. Case of the Crimson Pulse basically works the same way. So I think if this card's going to show up, it's going to show up in the like Flame of Keld or Experimental Frenzy role. Both cards which saw a lot of play in their standards not that long ago, where you're playing like mono red aggro, where you're playing your Swift Spears and your Phoenix Chicks, or mono red burn with Lightning Strikes and play with Flare, some mix of that. All these like 1 drops, 2 drops, and then Case of Crimson Pulse, you dump your hand, it comes down, it draws you 2. You cast those cards real quick, salve it, which is going to happen really quickly in a mono red deck, and then once it's salved, it's all upside. You get to draw 3 cards each turn, 1 for your draw step, 2 from the case, and you just cast all your cheap stuff. You're discarding your hand is not going to be much of a drawback, because you're going to be able to dump your hand every turn anyway, and then you just parlay that card advantage into an easy win. So I think this looks like a really good enchantment for like mono red in standard. I don't know if it'll make it in the main deck. This might be the like, in the slower matchup, I bring this in to like grind you out, because it is 3 mana, do not really anything right away, and mono reds often want to force through as much damage as possible as quickly as possible, so it might be more of a sideboard card than a main deck card, but I think that's the style of home for this card. I don't think it's going to make it outside of standard. We'll have to wait and see, but I love cards like this, a way to give your aggro deck a little bit of extra juice. In Case of the Crimson Pulse does it really well. We also got Lost in the Maze. So Lost in the Maze, double blue and X enchantment with flash. When it ETBs, tap X target creatures, put his stun counter on each of those creatures you don't control, and then tapped creatures you control have hexproof. So Lost in the Maze, I think this is just a limited card. I don't really imagine this making it constructed. I imagine that the idea was to power up like Hilda and Hilda's Crown from Wilds of Eldraine, this like tap your opponent's stuff for value archetype. It turns out though, I really tried to make Hilda work because it's a unique design. It's really tough to make Hilda work, and I'm not sure Lost in the Maze really changes anything about it. The thing I do like about this card is it is kind of like hybrid bad removal / flash protection. Like Spectral Adversary, you can flash it in, you can use it to phase out your opponent's creatures to not take damage, or you can phase out your creatures to save them from removal. Lost in the Maze kind of works like that, right? You can like flash this in, tap down your own stuff just to give it hexproof to fizzle a removal spell, or you can tap down some of your opponent's stuff. We just haven't seen stun counter based removal actually be very good in 60 card formats. It's a great limited design, and maybe we'll get there eventually in Constructed. It's a cool way to give blue some more removal that still feels blue, but it turns out in competitive Magic, tapping your opponent's stuff down for a minute or two, a lot worse than just killing it forever, especially in a world where cards like Shieldred exist. They're going to keep generating value even if they're stunned and tapped out. So Lost in the Maze, cool for Hilda, a nice little upgrade there. Not that it's going to make Hilda into a real deck, but mostly a card that's going to be solid as like a weird sleep effect for limited. We also got what might be the worst mana rock of all time. Maybe that's a little hyperbolic, but boy, this card's bad. In Cryptex. So Cryptex, 2-mana artifact. It enters the battlefield untapped. You can tap it and collect evidence of 3 to add 1 mana of any color, and you put an unlock counter on it, and then you can sacrifice it to surveil 3 and draw 3 only if it has 5 or more unlock counters on it. So Cryptex, when you first read this card, you're like, wow, 2-mana mana rock. We never get 2-mana mana rocks. That's so exciting. But this is really like a corrupted Graphstone style mana rock. There's too many hoops you got to jump through, right? So think about this. Think about this. You're playing your commander game. It's on turn 2. You want to get your ramp on. You jam your Cryptex. The next turn, it does nothing because you don't have at least 3 mana value worth of cards in your graveyard. And the turn after that, it probably does nothing as well. And the turn after that, maybe you cast some spells and got it in the graveyard. You make 1 single mana by exiling stuff that you really wanted in your graveyard to Eternal Witness back later anyway, but you made your mana out of it. And then the next turn, it goes back to doing nothing because you don't have any mana value in your graveyard. All this to say, this is just way too inconsistent and too likely to do nothing to actually be a card that you can realistically put in a deck anywhere. I remember Corrupted Graphstone when it first came out. It's a 2-mana mana rock, but the fact that you need to have a card in your graveyard and the fact that it entered tap, but that was enough to just kill this card and have it see no play anywhere. So I'm very skeptical of Cryptex needing you to exile 3 mana value worth of cards every single turn to make a single mana is going to be worth playing. I guess even if you're playing a graveyard deck, which could get enough mana value in the graveyard to turn this into a real mana rock, do you really want to exile that stuff? Like, that was my other thought. Like, okay, maybe this is a mana rock for graveyard decks. Going back to my infamous Urborg Lurgoyf deck. But if I'm playing an Urborg Lurgoyf deck, you know what I want? Is cards in my graveyard to grow my Lurgoyfs, not to exile to make a single mana sometimes with Cryptex. So even the decks where this could work, it's not really going to work because you don't really want to be exiling the cards from your Madrotha deck, let's say. So I think just play a Arcane Signet, or a normal Signet, or a Talisman, or a Mind Stone, or a Thought Vessel, any of the 2-mana mana rocks that don't require you to jump through an absurd amount of hoops to just be a mana rock. If there's any place this could work, it's maybe a Proliferate deck where you plan on, like, I activate it once, then I proliferated a bunch to draw cards with it. But even there, is it worth it? I'm not even sure it's worth it. So Cryptex, I don't know. I'm sure I'm going to get bashed in the comments for this because a lot of people seem to really like this card, but I think this card is stone unplayable, not just in 60 card formats, but in Commander too. I think this is literally an unplayable Magic card that should show up in literally 0% of decks and really is one of the worst mana rocks, if you can even call it a mana rock, that has ever been printed. Finally today, we got some draft chaff stuff. You can check it all out over on MTGPreviews.com. Oh, I did want to shout out Fester Leech right in the middle. 1 mana 1/1 zombie leech. When it deals combat damage to a player, you mill 2 cards and you pay 2 to pump it into a 3/3, only activate it once per turn. Maybe in the like Golgari or Sultai Urborg Lurgoyf. We've talked a lot about Urborg Lurgoyf today, but maybe in those graveyard self-mill decks, this could show up in the 1-drop slot where you can attack with it on turn 2. Your opponent's probably not going to want to block because you can threaten to pump it and kill their creature, and then you start filling your graveyard to turn on your synergies. So not a busted card, but I think there's like some outside chance that in a self-mill deck, this could be a playable 1-drop in Standard. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers for today. So Let me know what you think about all these sweet new cards. Tell me how wrong I am about that new mana rock that isn't even really a mana rock. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back tomorrow with even more Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can check out yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the Against the Odds where we tried to combo off with Intruder Alarm in Timeless.